Hello and welcome to MoneyControl Pro Masters Virtual, our series of online summits featuring leaders and experts. Our guest today is Saurabh Mukherjea, the founder and chief investment officer of Marcellus Investment Managers. Saurabh is a former CEO of Ambit Capital, and he played a key role in Ambit's rise as a broker and wealth manager. He's also a well-known author. He's written 3 bestsellers, fourth book called The Victory Project. He's also a well-known author. Today, Saurabh is going to talk about how investors can benefit from the consolidation.
Reckoning is on good day, they make around 60-70% return on capital. Partly accounts for the mass market end of the biscuit market. Britannia plus Parle together is nearly 85% of the biscuit industry. There's very little competition between these two firms. The result is Britannia is a high-end monopolist and Parle is a low-end monopolist, right? The mass market monopolist. And each of these promoter families are worth $3-4 billion, right? So $8-9 billion of wealth between the two promoter families there, right? And very similar stories I could tell you about cooking oil, 90% between Marico and Adani franchises, 90% market share. Similarly, in hair oil, Nestle alone accounts for 97% of the baby milk market by our estimate. Ditto in glass-lined reactors, where GMM Pfaudler now accounts for 80% of the glass-lined reactor market. Glass-lined reactors are used to make pharmaceutical products, so dawai and chemicals and so on. Absolutely essential product, and GMM has a hammerlock there. And then there are lesser-known monopolies. Aliphatic amines, alkyl amines, and Balaji amines account for 90% of aliphatic amines. Aliphatic amines are an essential industrial chemical, right? And what you sort of notice about India is our country has created around 25-30 such monopolies, which take home 85% of the profits in their respective industries. And as a result of that, what you end up with is the chart on the left, right? So when we liberalized our country back in the 91-92 era, the top 20 profit generators in India took home, say, 15% of India's profits, right? So back in 92, 93, 94, the top 20 Indian families, top 20 Indian profit producers took home 15% of India's profits. If you come to FY20, the FY19 data is shown. FY20, our math suggests the top 20 Indian firms are taking home now 70% of the nation's profit pie, right? So 70% of the nation's profit pie is the top 20 firms. If you take 5 more firms, the top 25 profit generators in India, nearly 75% of the country's profits go to 20-25 families, right? By the time my career is done, my reckoning is the 20 elite families, right? So we're talking here about, say, ITC, we're talking here about Nestle and Asian Paints, Kotak and HDFC Bank, and TCS. These elite firms will take home basically 80% of the nation's profits. So at a very simple level, what's happened in our country is the stock market, of it you might as well forget about them. They're irrelevant really from a serious money-making perspective. I mean, you can do it as a hobby. You can have a play on something like, say, a State Bank of India or a Bank of Baroda as a bit of a hobby. But if you really want to make money, these 20-25 monopolists who are taking home 70-75% of the country's profit should be the core of your portfolio. Now, several questions arise obviously from this, right? The first one should be, why has this happened? Why has our country become dominated by 20 enormously powerful? It should be, well, how do you and I make money from this? So let me try to address these through a couple of charts, and then I'll hand it back to Ravi. So let's focus first on the simplest aspect of monopolies, right? How do monopolies make money for you and me? So what you tend to see with India's monopolies are, if you take, say, the top 30 odd monopolies in our country, the average return on capital employed of an 5%. Right? So at the higher end, firms like ITC, Nestle, in some of their business segments, we reckon are making ROC significantly north of 100%. And then, say, at the lower end, smaller monopolists like, say, Relaxo will be making ROCs of around 30%. You average out these monopolists, ROC comes to around 45%. Pre-tax ROC, numerator EBITDA, denominator capital employed. Industries of the Murugappa group, free cash flow is equal to return on capital minus cost of capital. This is the simplest equation in finance and the most powerful equation in finance. Free cash flow is return on capital minus cost of capital. And therefore, if you subtract from return on capital of 45%, assume you subtract cost of capital of 15%, free cash flow for a typical monopolist in our country is capital employed in a very similar way. 1/3 of it they dividend out. The monopolist typically owns 70% of his company. 1/3 of it he dividends out, and that dividend finances his lifestyle very nicely. 2/3 of the free cash flow the monopolist puts back into the business. Right? 2/3 of 30%. 2/3 of 30% means 20% of capital employed goes back into the business. If you keep putting back into the business 20% of capital employed, your earnings compound at 20%, and that's exactly what you see. Exactly what you see with in this chart on the table on the right. Right, this is our portfolio. I've anonymized the stock names just to sort of create some degree of sanity as hygiene around this. But a typical portfolio of Indian monopolists compounds earnings you see on the table on the right by 20%. So whether it's FY20, whether it's FY17 to 20, whether it's FY15 to 20, or indeed whether it's FY10 to 20, a monopolist portfolio will compound earnings at 20%, right? Which is ROC of 45 minus 15, 30% capital employed, 1/3 dividended out, 20% put back in, and the business grows at 20%. As I'm sure most of you know, Nifty earnings growth is zero across 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, 10 years. Nifty earnings growth is zero, right? Monopolist compounding is 20%. So that's why investing in these monopolies, whether COVID is happening, not happening, demonetization is happening, not happening, all of that becomes irrelevant. You go out there and you build a pack of monopolies and you enrich yourself with these families, right? Now, there's another way to think about this, and I'll just sort of stop this share and share with you a different chart to allow you to visualize how powerful this whole monopoly wealth machine is, right? So let's just share a slightly different chart where we can give you a different way to think about the monopoly compounding machine. Just 1 second. The sharing software is a little fiddly, so just give me 1 second to give you the right chart. Yeah. So this is the same chart that we were seeing a couple of minutes ago, where we've shown that the share of the top 20 monopolist profits have risen steadily over the last 30 years. The share of the top 20 monopolist profits has risen steadily over the last 30 years, from 15% in the early 90s to 60-70% today. Now, look at the last 10 years, right? Look at the last 10 years and see how rapidly the profit share line is climbing. This profit share line is top 20 monopolist profit share in the Indian profit pie, right? And see how rapidly the slope is increasing. In fact, in the last 4-5 years, the profit share line is going almost vertical, right? The top 20 families, dominance of corporate life is almost going vertical. Effectively, if you do the maths here in the last 10 years, the top 20 monopolists, right? We're talking TCS, HDFC Bank, Kotak Bank, Asian Paints, Reliance Industries, these sorts of firms, profits have compounded at 20% over the last 10 years. The rest of corporate India, the entirety of corporate India, sans the top 20 monopolists, profits have compounded at 1%. So 1% compounding for everybody else, including the Nifty, 20% compounding for the monopolist families and for those of us who build portfolios around monopolists, right? Now, let's go back to the preceding PPT and ask, why is this happening? Why are 20 families basically running away with the entire country's profits, right? Why is this happening? So in order to understand that, I'll give you a couple of books to you can read at your leisure, right? So these are the 3 best books I have found on understanding how monopolies get built and how monopolies get built. So these are the 3 best books I have found on how monopolies get built and how much money you can make from it. These are very different types of books, and each gives you a different way to think about monopoly wealth compounding, right? What Robert Gordon does in his epic survey of American history is he helps you understand how America developed when they were at the corresponding phase of their development as we are today. So America between 1880 to 1930 was exactly like India today. 1880, America did not have a single supermarket. It was a village economy, right? Then came the railroads in 1880s, the telegraph in the 90s, the motor car in the 1900 to 1920 era. By 1930, America had 500,000 supermarkets. The local kirana store was dead. And in that 50-year period of 1880 to 1930, in that 50-year period came all the famous American brands you and I know about. So whether it's Heinz, whether it's Kellogg's, Pillsbury, Wrangler, Wrigley's, they all came in that 50-year period. Why did they come in the 50-year period? I'm sure in 1880 Americans were having ketchup, but ketchup was a local business. Each village, each region had its own ketchup manufacturer. Over the next 50 years, Heinz consolidated the ketchup industry. They were the most efficient ketchup manufacturer. They acquired the other ketchup companies or they destroyed them financially. And Heinz is the ketchup giant you and I know about today, right? The same thing is happening in our country. So when I migrated to India in 2008, I flew to Lucknow, rented an Innova and went in a 50-kilometer radius of Lucknow. Every village had a atta ka chakki, an oil mill and a rice dehusking operation. Around 30 people would work in these cottage industries. 2018, I made the same journey again. In that 10-year period, I realized that all the atta ka chakki and oil mills and rice dehusking operations were wiped out. Each village had 30 people who had lost their jobs. And these 30 people were now driving cycle rickshaws in Noida or in Lucknow. But that meant that the atta that they were consuming was ITC Ashirwad atta, the oil they were consuming was Saffola ka cooking oil, and the rice was some other branded rice, right? So the destruction of the small business, and I'm deliberately giving an extreme example, the destruction of the subscale SME or the subscale regional player is the flip side of the rise of the modern monopolists in our country. Right? And this process is unstoppable. The more we network the economy, right? GST, broadband, 4G, then 5G, I'm sure, low-cost airlines, modern highway networks, fast trains, the more we network the economy, the more we decimate the regional player, the greater the profit share of the monopolist, right? So this aspect of development, the Robert Gordon book, was first 150 pages, capture beautifully. There's another aspect of monopolization, which the Jonathan Tepper book helps you understand, which is the use of technology to destroy competition. And this book, The Myth of Capitalism, gives you superb examples of how Google, Microsoft, and Facebook, especially Google and Facebook, how they destroy their competitors. A lot of those techniques are being used by some of India's most powerful listed entities to wreck their competition, right? And if you go to our Marcellus.in or you read my books, you'll see Asian Paints is fundamentally actually a technology monopoly. It's only secondarily a paint company. Asian Paints is the world's finest big data implementation of SAP, right? Similarly, Bajaj Finance is actually a data science company. It's superficial in NBFC. In reality, Bajaj Finance is the most adept user of Salesforce and big data that our country has seen. And increasingly, the use of high tech by whether it's a Dr. Lal Path Labs, whether it is Asian Paints, Pidilite, HDFC Life, HDFC Bank, is becoming core to their ability to monopolize gigantic industries. Right? So there are two different aspects. One is the traditional story around monopolies, which is the decimation of small businesses, subscale small businesses who cannot survive in a formalized networked Indian economy. That explains much of the rise of firms like Marico, like Nestle, like Britannia. And the other is the use of high-tech, modern technology, big data, data science, SAP, Salesforce, to create barriers to entry around data and identification of profit opportunities. Right? Your and my job as investors is to get to the bottom of this. Right? So the three things that helped us enormously make a lot of money out of this monopolization in our countries. Firstly, making sure that we identify companies who are not stealing money. Because if you steal money, whether you're a monopolist or not, I'm not going to make money. You, the promoter, will take my money and run away. Second is we've looked for industries. We looked for industries where the canvas is big. We look for industries where the canvas is big, where the growth runway is epic, where over the next 10, 20 years, we can make a lot of money. There could be niche industries. Allopathic amines is niche. But allopathic amines is an absolutely essential product for the pharma and chemicals industry. And therefore, as those industries grow, the growth runway for allopathic amines improves, right? At a more obvious level, something like biscuits, something like small cars, obviously has a growth runway. So look for clean promoters, look for a growth runway, and most importantly, figure out, doing research, reading books, does the company have a barrier to entry? If the company has a barrier to entry, then look at the ROC. Is the ROC above 40-45%? If so, then the company is participating in the trend shown on the left. Load on to it and make money over the next 10 years. Right? The next 10 years will be epic period for monopoly compounding in India. And I'm sure all of you will enrich yourselves by loading up your portfolio with Indian monopolies. So I'll stop there, Ravi. I'll stop there. And if you have any questions, happy to try to answer them.
Thanks, Saurabh. That was a very fascinating introduction to this. The first question I wanted to ask you was how broadly or narrowly would you define a monopoly? But you have answered that. You're saying even something as niche as an aliphatic amines would be classified as a monopoly, right there.
But lovely question. Yeah, go on, sir. Go on.
Sorry, please continue.
So I was saying this aspect, what you raised is a super question, right? Because there are a lot of companies which are big. They are big in market share, but they're not really monopolists. So let's take an example of this. Indigo's market share is very big, right? I would believe after the demise of Kingfisher and Jet, effectively Indigo is the majority of the market share. Between Indigo and SpiceJet, they certainly are 80%, 90% of the airline market. But if you notice, neither has any pricing power. So if you take Indigo's last 10 years, their annual growth in passenger volumes has been around 20%, right? They've shown good growth in passenger volumes. But their profit growth is close to zero. And the reason for that is because they're not able to build a barrier to entry. Every time volumes go up, they cut their tariffs. As a result, profits don't grow, which is another way of saying, and Indigo is never able to get return on capital above cost of capital. So most large Indian companies suffer from what I call this Indigo Ace or airlines problem, I call it. This is the most basic problem in business life in our country. Companies build scale, but they don't build barriers to entry, right? And hence you and I as shareholders don't get compounding. 70% of Nifty companies have this problem. 90% of the BSE 500 has this problem. And there are numerous gigantic companies in India who see growth in volume, but they don't see growth in earnings, which means the shareholder makes nothing, which is why the Nifty's 10-year, 5-year earnings compounding is zilch. On the other hand, as you rightly picked up, Ravi, smaller niche players, GMM Pfaudler is what market cap is $1.2 billion. It's a niche player, but in its industry of glass-lined vessels. Glass-lined vessels is basically nothing but a gigantic version of this coffee cup, right? So a coffee cup the size of this room in which Cipla or Dr. Reddy's make their pharmaceutical products. GMM Pfaudler is the world leader in it. In India, they now have around 80% market share, right? They have a 9-month waiting list. The pharma companies, the Dr. Reddy's, the Divi's Lab will pay them any amount of money to get their products quicker. So price becomes irrelevant. So one way to understand a monopoly is companies for whom price becomes irrelevant, where market share and market dominance is not on the basis of price. It's on the basis of other strengths that the company has built. Whenever you see price-based competition, you know this company is not a monopoly, regardless of how big the market cap might be.
So pricing power is obviously one very important criteria. How else do you spot these monopolies? Are there any rules of thumb? Say for example, ROCE being way higher than the cost of capital is one thumb rule which you suggested.
Yeah, so let's start with the simplest way to do it. The simplest way to do it is take a 10-year data cut. Over the last 10 years, you need to see ROC above pre-tax ROC.
Hello, Saurabh? Hi, can you hear me? Okay. It seems that Saurabh has been disconnected. We'll wait for him to join back.
Oh, yeah, I'm back. So I technically dropped off, so I ran for my Geo dongle, which is my back. So yes, I'm getting my backup fired up in case it goes on the blink again. So just coming back to the criteria for a monopoly, the simplest one is look at the last 10 years and look for a company where return on capital exceeds 15% every single year, 10 out of 10 years. And that's the simplest way. The second way is look to see whether the company indulges in price wars. Any company which gets into a price war isn't a monopoly. Because if you were a monopoly, why would you have to fight on price? Right? The third way is Go to dealers and distributors. And it's quite easy to do. Go to dealers and distributors and ask them that when customers come to your shop, do they say just baby milk, kuch bhi de do, or do they say Nestle chahiye? Right? If they say kuch bhi de do, baby milk or tile or plywood, then that's no monopoly. No, there is no brand recognition. That's nothing. Right? So one of the simplest ways to assess pricing power is to ask the dealer, when a customer comes to your shop to buy tiles, does he mention a specific brand, or he says whatever, kuch bhi de do? If it's kuch bhi de do, don't even think about buying that tile company or that plywood company or that sanitary ware company, etc., etc., etc. Right? So there are three different ways: simple financial metrics, then look for price first, and the final qualitative. The most useful qualitative check is dealer distributor surveys.
Okay, fair enough. So, how do you deal with the risk posed by antitrust regulations? I mean, or are we giving that too much value, especially in the Indian context?
So one of the things you'll see is that none of the monopolists in India, right? None of the monopolists, and I've described this in Unusual Billionaires in great detail. None of the monopolists in India hike prices by more than 1 to 2% per annum. Right? So they're super smart. They know that if you want to stay, outside the limelight on this subject, keep your price rises modest. Right? The second reason 1 to 2% price hikes are lethal is typically in India, costs rise at around 6% per annum. Therefore, if you as a large company, efficient company, can make do with a 1 to 2% hike, then the delta between 6 and 2, say 4% per delta, over 5 years will bankrupt your competition and you become the king. Right? So this route to monopolization has been now a time-tested path, and it's very difficult for antitrust regulators anywhere in the world. It's very difficult for antitrust regulators anywhere in the world to clamp down on companies who are hiking prices consistently below the rate of CPI inflation. Right? And which is why even in America it's very difficult for the Department of Justice to go after Google. Google is trying to show me any outcome which is against the consumer's interest. I'm giving you search basically free. I'm giving you music on YouTube pretty much free. If I'm giving you everything free, why are you unhappy about that? What's the problem here? Right? And obviously this gets into pretty complex issues, which is why that the Myth of Capitalism book is such a super read. What that book teaches you, if you're a smart business person, you can go and capture an entire market, destroy the competition, and there is nothing that the regulator can do about it. Right? And in fact, there's so much happening in our country where if you read the book, your mind will start flying about 6 other monopolies that I hadn't thought of till I read Myth of Capitalism. After reading that book, 6 other ideas came about the next generation of monopolies that Marcellus can identify.
At the beginning of your business is unique in some sense because we have such a large number of companies which are monopolies. So what is unique to the Indian setup?
Yeah, so super question, Ravi. Where I think one way to think about it is look at paint. Right? Asian Paints 41% ROC, and they've shown in chapter 2 of Unusual Billionaires. Over the last 50 years, the Asian Paints' return on capital has gone up almost from 20% or 15-20% to 40-45%. Very similar situation with Pidilite. Pidilite's ROC is now moving towards 40%, steady rise over the last 30 years. Right? Now, if you look at Sherwin-Williams, the world's largest paint company, headquartered in America, Sherwin-Williams is nowhere as profitable as Asian Paints. Right? Sherwin-Williams' ROC is almost half that of Asian Paints. It neither grows as fast as Asian Paints. That is understandable. It's in a mature economy. But the ROCs are nowhere near. So basically what happens is because it's so difficult in India logistically to set up 20 factories, 75,000 dealerships, a complex network of raw material manufacturing onto some dealerships. If you can master supply chain logistics in India, using technology, using big data, that's fundamentally what Asian Paints has done. Asian Paints has used big data for 50 years. For 50 years, Ravi, Asian Paints has collected data, paint demand data, for every neighborhood in India for every hour of the day for 5,000 SKUs. That mountain of data gives them complete mastery of supply chain logistics. Today they have 75,000 they deliver 4 times a day. They deliver nearly 3 times a day to across the 75,000 dealers. That mastery of logistics makes a supply chain expert. In America, you cannot do this. In America, delivering paint every 3 hours is not a big deal. There's a road network, there's a well-established electronic network. And so in Europe and America and developed markets, building barriers to entry around distribution and logistics is much harder, right? So this is one facet of it. The second facet of it, Ravi, is our country is still evolving. So data itself is actually incredibly valuable to capture. So if you look at Bajaj Finance, our reading is Bajaj Finance fundamentally is a big data monopoly. 10 years ago, my neighbor Rajiv Jain figured out that if they collected more data on people like you and me, they would be able to understand people like you and me better, identify profit pools that nobody else could see. And that's exactly what they did. Bajaj Finance has collected more data on our strata of society than any other Indian financial services companies, used that data to build moated profit pools in, say, the doctors and dentists segment, chartered accountant segment, generally the self-employed segment, then the consumer durable segment, right? And in a Western economy, those data sets are far more stable. Our country is changing so fast that if you're able to collect data, you basically get the modern version of Asian Paints. So the supply chain logistics monopolies are Asian Paints, Pidilite type of companies, so to some extent Marico as well. The big data monopolies are HDFC Life, HDFC Bank, Bajaj Finance, and I think there will be more such plays. Companies who are able to use big data to have a complete mastery of, say, your user base, the MoneyControl user base, and Bajaj Finance has taken it to a level where if they have your PAN number in your address, that's all they need to make a lending decision in 2 minutes.
Fair enough. But so when it comes to valuing such a monopoly, how do you monitor, say, government policy risk? Because how flexible that is. Today they will say take coal for free, you pay me a fixed fee. Tomorrow they will say no, we are going to auction it. Then things will be tied up in the courts for 15 years. How do you monitor that risk? Because all said and done, what we have seen even after liberalization is, while governments might be politically stable, when it comes to policy making, there are a lot of flip-flops in India.
So most of these products, right, are products where, as I said, the government will interfere if they believe that there is there's a consumer interest which is being jeopardized. Right, very difficult to see how an Asian Paints is jeopardizing the consumer interest, given that over 30 years their average price hike has been 1.5% or 2%. Right. Now, that being said, I also have to concede that from time to time there are naughty people in our country who go and basically lobby the government. There are naughty people who can't compete with, say, an Asian Paints or a Bajaj Finance or a Pidilite on an equal footing. And if you can't compete with them on an equal footing, the normal sort of response in India on the part of naughty people is to go and try to lobby and spite the regulator, coerce the regulator into taking punitive action needlessly against these. And that's where the Indian monopolist also has sharp elbows. Right? None of these companies are babes in the wood. They have sharp elbows. They do what it takes to protect their interests. So I'll give you an example of this. I think it was last year or year before last, 2019 or 2018, the government of India expedited a law which said that FDI in cigarettes, foreign direct investment in cigarettes, is banned. Now, I can't remember, high street protests. I can't remember marches down, the Western Express Highway in Bombay or in Gate Club lawns in Delhi, where the public had insisted that we want to see FDI and cigarettes banned. But FDI and cigarettes did get banned. The government expedited relevant legislation. It doesn't take too much imagination to figure out who benefits from banning a foreign direct investment in cigarettes. So we also have to be realistic. We live in the real world, and in the real world, the sorts of monopolists we invest in, they have sharp elbows. They know exactly how to get things done. They have naughty rivals who use policy to try to jam the monopolist. The monopolist has more than enough lawyers and lobbyists working for them, and they know how to respond back in kind.
Right. So we'll take a viewer question now. Hemant Doshi is asking, how should one treat a diversified company like, for example, Reliance, which is present in 3 different sectors, and has a dominant presence in three of them, even though it might not be a monopoly in all.
So look, whether a company is diversified or monoline, initially my focus is not that. Our focus in Marcellus tends to be, does the company generate a return on capital above cost of capital on a consistent basis, right? So as I said a few minutes back, the vast majority of Nifty companies struggle to do that, right? The vast majority of Nifty companies struggle to do that. That simplifies our life. We don't look at those companies where return on capital doesn't exceed pre-tax ROC. If it doesn't exceed 15%, it's not really worth my while to look at it. What's the point, right? The company can't even generate on a consistent basis a return on capital above its cost of capital. So we at Marcellus tend to stay away from these sorts of companies. As I said, 70% of Nifty suffers from this. 90% of the Indian stock market suffers from this. Whether it's a conglomerate or not is a secondary consideration. First consideration would be, can said company generate a pre-tax ROC above 15% on a consistent basis? If it doesn't, then it's suggestive immediately of a franchise which cannot generate shareholder value.
So, under what conditions can a monopoly lose pricing power?
So the obvious one, actually there are three conditions. First is the promoter loses his grip on his capital allocation. He starts getting greedy, he starts hiking prices, he starts taking money out of the company, both through covert means and overt means, such as, say, very large dividends to himself. The second is users changes taste change, right? Users taste change. Example being Kodak. Right, so Kodak remains a monopoly in film. The only problem is you and I don't use film anymore. Right? So similarly, if, say for the sake of argument, if all of us become that much more healthy over the next 10 years, we have less cooking oil, we have less fried food, we have more roti, less paratha, we have more salad and sprouts than fried sabji, then Saffola obviously suffers on account of that, right? If all of us decide to become much more healthy on this call and we consume less cooking oil, Saffola could stay dominant in cooking oil, just like Kodak is in film, but cooking oil itself could become a much more low growth segment, right? So that's the second challenge to monopoly, where customers' tastes change, right? So first is the promoter loses his grip on capital allocation. The second is customers' taste change, and the third is the one that which is the more obvious that people keep thinking about, which is a new entrant comes in. A new entrant comes in with a fundamentally different business model and disrupts the incumbent. So an example would be, say, the rise of Zerodha and the demise of traditional Indian stockbrokers, who are basically really struggling to deal with what is a completely different way of doing stockbroking.
Right. So these are essentially the signs also to watch out for a monopoly to get disrupted completely. The loss of price.
That's right. So your exit decision. So in a way, you're not more focused on the right issue. The sell discipline, the exit decision is around these sorts of things. The entry decision is around cleanliness of accounts. The entry decision is around cleanliness of accounts, monopoly dominance of ideally an essential product. You want to see an absence of price wars. You want to see ROC consistently above 15%. The exit decision is the reverse. If ROC starts going below 15%, if the capital allocation starts becoming shabby, if new entrants come in, if the product itself starts becoming less essential, it's time to check out there.
Saurabh, from your writings, I believe your approach to investing, which you have described in Coffee Can, is to buy a stock and forget about it for a long period of time. But still, I can't resist asking this question. Would you sell these monopoly companies if they are really richly valued in a market which is overbought?
So yes, we have sold companies. In 4 years, we've sold 4 companies and bought 4 as well. But this sell decision, Ravi, as we just discussed, has nothing to do with price. Price has no relevance in the sell decision, right? What influences the sell decision is the price could be high or low, but if we can see the barriers to entry are eroding, or the capital allocation is becoming incrementally inferior, or return on capital is going below cost of capital, then we need to check out. We can't say, well, price, this or that. Price has no relevance to the decision. So one way to think about it, Ravi, is one of the ways over the years I've learned is, regardless whether I'm buying a stock or a shirt or a car, I've realized in life, whenever one bases a decision whenever one bases a purchase decision, whether it's a shirt or a car or a stock, as soon as you base your purchase decision on the basis of price, that typically is a signal to you that you don't know enough about the product, right? So I used to do it with shirts, right? I don't really know, I'm not very good at buying clothes. So every year or so, I'd go to the local shopping mall and buy 4 or 5 shirts for myself. Because I knew nothing about shirts, I would buy cheap shirts. I don't know, in 6 months the collar would sag, the washing machine would have destroyed the colors. And my wife would tell me year after year that why do you do this nonsense, right? Why do you buy these shabby clothes for yourself? You buy cheap stuff and look at you 6 months out, you sort of look, unfit for a civilized company. So then one fine year, 5 years ago, she said, now this is enough. I will now buy your shirts. So she said, once a year, we go abroad. My parents live in the UK, so she said once a year we'll go to central London. We will spend X amount of rupees and we'll buy you 5 shirts. So first year I said, my God, what are you doing? You're middle class people. Why are you spending so much money on shirts and so on? But then after a year I saw the point. Right, so shirts she was buying were lasting longer. Right, the collar wasn't breaking, the color wasn't fading. In my line of work, where I have to sort of present to the great and the good, I was looking slightly smarter. They thought, this guy might be worth giving money to his clothes to look good. And therefore the return on investment to us from buying slightly more expensive shirts was actually worthwhile. Now, had I not understood what is a good shirt or a bad shirt, and had I just tried to sort of buy it myself, it doesn't work because I don't know what is a good shirt. My wife understood how to figure out what is a high quality shirt. She therefore didn't base her decisions on price, unlike stupid me who did. And therefore I ended up getting a better deal, right? And this is what happens in the stock market. An Asian Paints or a Nestle, their fair value PE multiple would be in the vicinity of 200 to 260 times. Most people don't understand that, so they believe that 60, 70 times it's expensive. And most people end up buying some junk stock at 10, 11, 12 times PE, where probably the numbers are fraud. And even if the numbers aren't fraud, it's highly unlikely the promoter will be able to generate management will be able to generate a return on capital above cost of capital. And hence this perpetual fallacy that price has something to do with investing perpetuates. In the appendix of Coffee Can Investing, we've given you lots of analysis on why price has nothing to do with making money.
Fair enough. So, you talked about how a monopoly gets disrupted. Let me approach the same thing from a different angle. How do you assess the sustainability of the moats around such a business? I mean, you're an investor, you're almost ready to make a purchase decision, but how can you be sure, that the moat would be sustainable?
Sure. So let's take Asian Paints as an example, right? So chapter 2 of Unusual Billionaires is Asian Paints. It took us the best part of 3 years to write that chapter. It took us 3 years to figure out that Asian Paints' moat is predicated on data. 50 years of proprietary data, 1970 to 2020, every hour of the day, every neighborhood in India, right? 5,000 SKUs. So if we go to Asian Paints' headquarters in Karina right now, Ravi, if you go right now and we ask them that, look, on 11th November at 11 a.m. In Jayanagar, in Bangalore, in 4th block, what colors will you sell? They will tell us right now with 98% accuracy, right? So once we understood that, right, we figured out that the entire Asian Paints barrier to entry is around data, right? And then when we spoke to their competitors, effectively they told us that nobody in their right mind, unless somebody is mentally deranged, nobody in their right mind will dare compete with Asian Paints. You can have a paint company, but you should have no illusions that you'll be able to compete with Asian Paints. You cannot, because the data advantage is so immense, right? Now, effectively, the data advantage gives them an 8-day working capital cycle. Actually, it's become less than that. Standalone basis, I think working capital cycle is now 4 days, right? This is a $22 billion company. From purchasing raw material to cash and bank, Ravi, 4-day working capital cycle, right? The next best company, Berger Paints, high-class company, does the same thing in 45 days. And the number 3 player, AkzoNobel, the world number 2, does the same thing in nearly 100 days, right? The whole thing, therefore, is a play on the working capital cycle, which in turn is driven by data analytics. Right? It's an SAP system which allows Asian Paints to go from raw material to cash and bank in 4-5 days. Right? So what the Berger management team really helped us do is helped us understand. They said, look, What Asian Paints can do in 4, we need 40 because we don't have that granularity of data. But hey, Saurabh, we need 40, AkzoNobel needs 100. And the latest central, which I think is JSW Paint, will be even worse, right? It will be probably working capital days of 150. Now, maybe this can be broken, but we haven't met anybody in India who believes this can be broken because the data advantage is so intense, right? Now, there are other layers to Asian Paints' monopoly, right? And our job is to understand the various layers of the monopoly. This sort of research takes sometimes 2 years, sometimes a year. Now that we have understood what we do, we can do it in a year. It took us HDFC Life, it took us a year to figure out this piece. Right? HDFC Life superficially sounds similar to iPru Life, SBI Life, Max and so on. In reality, the difference is night and day. Just like Asian Paints and AkzoNobel superficially are in the same sector. But for all intents and purposes, the economics of the businesses are entirely different. Because Asian is a monopolized, moated model. They talk with HDFC Life versus, say, iPru Life. Actually, they are very, very different businesses. Right? As a result, HDFC Life as a moated compounding engine has a long runway. Now, our job, and every investor's job who's on this call, is to understand the moat first and then surveillance it. Price has nothing to do with this. Right? The reason people go on and on about price is because that's the only thing they can check on the screen, but it has no value. So the notion that you'll buy low, sell high, that's about, it's like some sort of mumbo jumbo that you'll buy low, sell high. By definition, you will, right? Everybody wants to do that. And just like I want to eat my dinner, people want to buy low and sell high. But the fact that buying, that doesn't mean the share price will give you any information on when to buy or when to sell. Both of that signals, when to buy and when to sell, is basis this sort of qualitative research, which is troublesome to do, but it is not impossible. And in this day and era where through the screen that I'm staring at, we can access pretty much the whole world, it's become very, very doable to do this sort of analysis on what exactly is HDFC Life's barrier to entry. Why is HDFC Life consistently able to produce return on embedded value sustainably higher than its competitors? Right? What is the moat there? First understand that, and then you can gauge. Right? Then you can surveillance the moat. So yes, we rarely sell, but we don't sleep. It doesn't mean sort of we sit back and relax. I'm sort of in Goa relaxing on the beach while Asian Paint compound. There's a lot of surveillance required to understand why is the moat sustaining. So, for example, whilst we invested in Pidilite 4 years back, a lot of our understanding on why Pidilite is able to strengthen the moat year upon year has actually come in the last year and a half. As we've understood just how much hard work Pidilite puts in succession planning, not just for Bharatpuri, but for the whole chain of command, right? They've got enormous amounts of work going in to train another 50 managers to perform at a very high level, right? Bharatpuri is just the face of that. Now, that is another type of moat. A country which is desperately short of managers, the management strength of an Asian Paints, a Pidilite, an HDFC Bank becomes another moat, right? You have an army of high-quality managers. That is another moat. But if you don't understand it, you sort of, get swayed by, COVID ho gaya, ya P multiple chad gaya, gir gaya, some broker writes some nonsense, and you'll be buying and selling on the back of that.
Fair enough. Good. So I know you have said that, it is not about timing when you identify such companies, but still I have to ask you this. Do you think that this COVID episode which we are seeing now, it will kind of accelerate the formation and the sustainability of these monopolies? A related question we have got from a viewer called Vishal Satidasani, who wants to know what is the future hold for IT companies. Like TCS has been one example which you have been talking about.
So obviously COVID or any exigency, and there will be several exigencies in the years ahead. The bond was one, COVID is one. There will be several such exigencies. All of these exigencies, all of these natural or man-made disasters will wipe out the competition, and it will strengthen the hand of the income of the dominant monopolist. The reason is quite simple. Dominant monopolist is able to generate a return on capital far above cost of capital. Thus, the dominant monopolist has bucket loads of free cash flow, which give him spare capacity, a reservoir of strength, which he can use in a circumstance like, say, April, May, to decimate the competition. And Asian Paints saw that. We did that, right? You saw with Asian Paints how through the first 15-20 days of April, they absolutely eviscerated the competition by first giving I think 200, 300 crores to their dealers, the shopkeepers, then around 10, 20 crores to their painters, and then finally a pay rise, a hefty pay rise to their staff, all done in the first 15 days of April. My math suggests that in those 15 days, Asian Paints distributed the entire free cash flow of the rest of the paint industry, excluding Asian Paints, and they made it they almost cast it in iron that when the world recovers from COVID, Asian Paints will gain substantial market share, which is actually what's happened through June, July, August, right? And there are several examples of this. I could do sort of half an hour session for MoneyControl on how the dominant monopolists have used COVID to further entrench their strengths. And this will carry on. India has many more exigencies to come in the years ahead, and the second-rung players will get wiped out. Now, the broader question then becomes, what do you do with the rest of your portfolio? If you are invested in things which don't have this sort of strength, which is if you're invested in some number 3 player or number 4 player in the sector because somebody told you low PE multiples are the right way to go. My reckoning is have a look at your investment and say, can I see a situation in the next 1 or 2 years where the said company can actually gain market share, gain competitive advantage vis-a-vis the leader? If you can't convince yourself that is the case, get out of it and go and buy the market leader. Ravi, back to you.
Yeah. I have one question. So, is there a risk that a monopoly will lead to poor corporate governance or lazy management? Any example that comes to your mind?
So there are plenty of PSU monopolies, right? Why does Marcellus not have PSU monopolies? I mean, Coal India is a monopoly, Steel Authority of India is sort of a monopoly, Power Grid is a monopoly. But are they great compounders? They're not, right? They're not great compounders, to be fair to them, because they're serving the government of India's interests. They're serving the nation's interests. And we should be glad about that ONGC, Coal India, NTPC, Steel Authority of India, Power Grid, these powerhouse companies, State Bank of India, they're serving the nation's interests, rightly so. They're not there to look after the interests of minority shareholders like Marcellus. And hence our job is to focus on companies who are serving the interests of folks like us rather than of other stakeholders. So there are other monopolies in India beyond what I've discussed, but these other monopolies service the interest of other stakeholders such as the promoter. The most simplest ones being the PSUs I mentioned.
Great. So I think we have almost come to the end of our session. Is there anything else that you would like to add, sir, for the benefit of our viewers?
No, so my only request to your viewers would be, there's a whole world of information available in those 3 books I suggested. Robert Gordon, Competition Demystified, and The Myth of Capitalism. You can read those, or if you don't want to read those, then there's 3 Indian books you could consider reading. Right? If you want to focus on books written for the Indian market, then let me quickly show you 3 books written for the Indian market. Because a lot of people, when I first 5-6 years in India, people used to ask me, can we have books for the Indian market? So we've written 3 books for the Indian market on very similar subjects of how to identify monopolies and make money from that. Unusual Billionaires was published in 2016, Coffee Can Invest in 2018, as Ravi kindly mentioned. Victory Project came last week. Incidentally, all 3 have become #1 bestsellers on Amazon. Victory Project became a #1 bestseller last week. So read, folks, read, because as Charlie Munger said, he hasn't met a single smart person in his life who doesn't read non-stop. If you want to succeed as an investor, read non-stop. That's your greatest sort of, wealth. That is the greatest way to compound your wealth in this great country of ours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saurabh, for a highly entertaining and also educative session.